When the United States deployed nuclear weapons against the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it introduced the world to the horror that is nuclear attack. When the Soviet Union tested nuclear weapons in 1949, they introduced the world to the prospect of nuclear war. And from that point on, through the 50s, 60s, all the way through to the fall of the Soviet Union, entire generations would grow up trained to rapidly scurry to bomb shelters or to duck under their desks when they heard an air raid siren, because at any given moment, whether because of premeditation or some miscalculation on one side or another, there was always a chance, a possibility, that the massive atomic arsenals of the Soviet Union and the United States would at some point be launched, and with their launch would come the end of civilization as we knew it. The fall of the Soviet Union meant many things to many people, but almost universally it was seen as heralding a massive reduction in the danger of an apocalyptic global nuclear exchange. And that's a good thing, right? But 2022 is absolutely turning into a year of nostalgia. We're doing conventional land wars in Europe again, which is something I thought that we gave up in the 1930s and 40s. And of course, the good old-fashioned Cold War era nuclear saber alert rattling is back, at least if you follow the media. Everything from the Russian nuclear alert, which came in the very early days of this crisis, to the recent testing of Rs-28 Sarmat, which is a heavy ICBM, which has been extensively covered in Western media. All of this comes together into some quite, let's just say, electrifying coverage, which does a very good job of, I think, upping the general anxiety levels around the world. After all, while the conventional conflict in Ukraine may not directly affect you, depending on where you live on this planet, a nuclear conflict in Ukraine would absolutely change your way of life. And as a result, it catches the imagination. The CNN-NBC article I've quoted there said nearly 70% of Americans are worried about a nuclear attack, according to a survey. And indeed, a lot of the emails I've received, about a quarter of them, have asked me to cover this question of nuclear annihilation. Every time a Russian authority opens their mouth and says the N-word, it seems that the apocalypse is one step closer. But let's just hold up a minute. Before you go putting your family life savings into a doomsday bunker or subscribing to a Vault-Tec survival vault and planning on how you're going to fend off raiders and mutant wildlife in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, just stop and think for a moment. How likely is this conflict actually to go nuclear? What am I going to cover today? I'm actually going to do a bit of a reverse clickbait video. Instead of trying to scare you with the prospect of nuclear war, I'm basically going to cover why you shouldn't be scared. Why most of these atomic saber-rattling threats that we've seen have been blown out of all proportion. And I'm going to look instead quite closely at what Russia has been doing in terms of its alerts and its posturing. I'm then going to do a little bit of a history lesson on nuclear coercion, which is the idea that you can threaten countries into doing what you want because you have nukes and they don't. I'm going to ask the question, does it work? Then I'm going to look at Russian nuclear doctrine. Is Putin a nuclear warmonger? What does Russian doctrine say about how they should use atomic weapons and why we should care? We're going to take those elements, we're going to put them together, and we're going to come up with an idea of how probable a nuclear exchange is in Ukraine. How likely is it that Putin presses the big proverbial red button, and as a result, there's a second sunrise over somewhere in Ukraine? Having examined why I think that those use cases are very, very limited in nature and very, very unlikely to eventuate, I will look at the situations where it might hypothetically occur and how other countries can act in order to keep the probability of that happening very, very low. There's a TLDR up front, as always, because I know not everyone's here for the 1 hour presentation. So here's the TLDR and the caveats. Russian public posturing is probably pretty empty. Russia is probably not actively intending to deploy nukes against anybody. There is a diplomatic reason that they like to rattle the nuclear saber occasionally, mostly due to the weakness of their current conventional position. But at the end of the day, those threats are probably pretty empty. The second point is that nuclear coercion usually doesn't work historically. Just because you have nuclear weapons and can threaten to use them usually doesn't mean that you automatically get your way in a crisis. Russian doctrine, Russian ideas on how to use nuclear weapons are actually very specific. They're very clear on the circumstances in which they would ordinarily use nuclear weapons. And surprise, surprise, none of those cases actually apply in the case of the Ukrainian conflict. I will say that deterrence and communication is key going forward, and that one of the ways that we can keep the threat of nuclear threat low is the West assuring Russia that in the event that it does deploy nuclear weapons first, there will be a response from the West that makes it, let's just say, inadvisable for Russia to take the step of deploying those nuclear weapons. And some caveats, of course. First of all, I'm not a nuclear strategist. I'm taking a historian's eye, so the eye of someone who studied the Cold War to this scenario. Might surprise you, but non-nuclear countries don't produce too many nuclear strategists as a general rule. It's a bit of a limited career path. And while Australia probably would have benefited from a nuclear weapons program in order to counter some of the greater and more threatening examples of our wildlife, the reality is that we never really went down that road. So Australia is a non-nuclear weapons state. Also, I've simplified a lot of ideas here. I've done that out of necessity because we don't want to be here all day. And I'll also note that some of the conclusions I come to here are contested. I'll try and flag that where that is the case, specifically around parts of Russian doctrine. I'll try and flag where there is debate, but just don't take everything I say basically as a given. So, question 1. What is Russia actually doing that has everyone so terrified? Well, the first thing that they're doing is they're demonstrating nuclear and dual-use capabilities. So Russia has been developing a vast array of new nuclear and dual-use delivery systems for some time now. The one that recently captured everyone's attention was the RS-28 Sarmat. So this is a heavyweight ICBM that's capable of carrying multiple independent re-entry vehicles, or also capable of carrying the avant-garde hypersonic glide nuclear delivery vehicle. There's also a lot of talk recently of how Russia is deploying nuclear-capable systems all over the place as a sort of posturing. They've been talking about deploying them to the Baltic or towards the Finnish border, or ways that might threaten the Nordic countries. Surely this is a sign that we should all panic. When Russia says they're deploying nuclear-capable systems, surely that's a signal that they're really, really serious. We'll come back to that. The second thing that they've been doing is that there's been what some would describe as saber-rattling rhetoric. The West, at least, has accused Russia of engaging in unprecedented nuclear saber-rattling. This is where you drum up the threat of atomic war or a nuclear exchange in order to extract some sort of diplomatic concession. The most commonly known example is the nuclear alert that Vladimir Putin announced near the beginning of the war, where he instructed his armed forces to put his nuclear forces in a state of strategic readiness. And of course, now that Finland and Sweden are discussing NATO membership, this is seemingly being threatened with the deployment of nuclear-capable weapons to the Baltic region. The question I have, and the question we should all have, is what are they attempting to do with this rhetoric and whether we should actually be worried? So let's look at the capabilities first and then the question of rhetoric in that context. When it comes to the capabilities, system development is not a response to the Ukrainian crisis. The systems that the Russians are rolling out and testing now, RS-28 Sarmat, Avangard, another one that they've announced, or at least they've talked about in recent years, Burevestnik, that's a nuclear-powered cruise missile, which sounds like a terrible idea to me, but, they've gone and they've done it and they've trialled the engine at the very least. These are systems with very, very long development timelines. They had decisions on their development made years and even decades ago. They're either science projects or industrial maintenance projects, in the case of the 9M730, or they're a combination of stockpile renewal and missile defense evasion. RS-28 Sarmat is there to replace aging missiles that are currently in service that will eventually need to go out of service. RS-28 is a better system that allows the Russians to replace them, not lifetime expand their existing missiles, and also future-proofs them against missile defense. Now, all of this is completely over the top, but there's no new threat here. When the Russians talk about these new systems, they talk about rendering NATO defenses completely useless. I'm going to reveal a secret here. NATO defenses are already completely useless against the Russian nuclear arsenal. The United States missile defense capability is not capable of fending off a launch at a strategic scale of Russia's nuclear arsenal against United States targets. It's just not. The number of independent re-entry vehicles, the number of decoys, and the technological sophistication of the weapons is just so great that the missile defense system of any country is completely incapable of fending them off. So these systems are completely over the top. They're countering a threat that doesn't really exist. In many ways, missile defense is like religion. Both sides agree that eventually, or choose to believe that eventually it might get to the point where it will work and prepare systems to counter a threat, even if that threat doesn't actually exist at this point. But there's nothing about the developments of these systems now that should be taken as a signaling mechanism. Like I said, they're long-term development systems, and also the Russians have sort of done everything right in order to lower the tension caused by these recent capability developments. The Russians provided advance notification of the fact that Sarmat was going to be tested, and they haven't demonstrated signs of increased readiness. So while Vladimir Putin makes an announcement that says that the rocket forces have to be in a state of strategic readiness, that hasn't translated into the Russians doing anything to actually posture their nuclear forces in a more aggressive way. What would that mean? As far as Western sources have gone, we haven't seen signs like, for example, the Russians putting a larger than normal number of ballistic missile submarines on patrol, so they have more missiles that are invulnerable at sea rather than vulnerable at port. We haven't seen the road mobile missiles dispersed from their bases to their concealed launching areas. They're still concentrated at their bases. We haven't seen increased activity or posturing in their silos or a change in their strategic readiness. So in other words, while there was an announcement, there's nothing about these capabilities being developed or the way they're currently being postured that should be taken as a nuclear threat. If this was serious nuclear signaling, so a sign from Russia that it's getting ready to use nuclear weapons, we're serious guys, you better concede, well, we'd expect that to be matched with nuclear posturing, which is how the weapons are deployed and prepared and are being ready for use or not. And as I said, there's no open source intelligence sign of that, and Western sources concur publicly that we haven't seen signs of increased nuclear readiness from the Russians. Plus, they've made efforts to avoid confusion. So I infer instead that they're targeting two different audiences. The first is the Russian domestic audience, who presumably needs to be reassured of the strength of Russia. The nuclear capability is a bedrock of Russian military strength. And even though the conventional military campaign is probably not going the way they wanted, and there are serious questions being raised over the capability and conduct of the Russian army, well, this is a reminder that Russia remains one of the world's greatest nuclear powers, and by warhead count, the greatest nuclear power. There's also the Western public. Not everyone in the public knows the intricacies of nuclear posturing. Not everyone understands Russian nuclear doctrine. So if you just see these statements in the media, it's going to cause fear. And fear might encourage members of the public to be a little more cautious about encouraging weapons shipments to Ukraine, a little bit more cautious about encouraging politicians to take a hard line towards Moscow. It might cause a little bit of fear and uncertainty. That, I suggest, is probably one of the primary audiences for the rhetoric. Which leads me to ask the question, does this kind of nuclear coercion work? Because you have nuclear weapons and making these sort of threats, does it mean that you get what you want automatically? And historically, I acknowledge this is a debated point, but I would say the answer is very much no. There are relatively few cases that you can point to where nations have successfully coerced another nation to do something with the threat of using nuclear force. Most of the examples that you can find that are arguably successful cases of coercion are from the absolutely earliest days of nuclear weapons, where there were relatively few nuclear weapon states and where the rules and regulations on their use weren't really set in stone. It's the US during that monopoly and near-monopoly period, so where the United States was the only power on the planet that had a practical nuclear capability, so the US was far more capable of using nuclear coercion during that era. There's also the USSR during the Suez Crisis, when Khrushchev actively rolled out threats of atomic strikes in order to get the French and the British to play ball on de-escalating the Suez Crisis. It's hard to find modern nuclear coercion cases, not where countries have deterred another country from attacking them using nukes, but where they've actively forced another country to comply. After all, we've actually seen examples of nuclear powers routinely choose to accept military defeat and reverse rather than revert to the use of nuclear weapons. The US didn't roll them out in Korea and accepted what basically can come down to a draw. It didn't roll them out in Vietnam or any of its conflicts since, where the US has suffered military reverses. The People's Republic of China invaded Vietnam and got a very bloody nose. There was no talk of nuclear weapons being employed against the Vietnamese in order to secure a better outcome. Nuclear powers don't routinely go around nuking people. That is one of the merciful facts of the Cold War and post-Cold War era. We even see countries choose restraint when they can probably get away with it. India had nuclear weapons long before Pakistan did, but India did not move immediately to use its nuclear weapons in order to destroy Pakistan, nor did it use its nuclear weapons to prevent Pakistan developing a nuclear capability. The US, during its nuclear monopoly era, possibly had a brief window in which the United States could have utilized its nuclear capabilities to try and threaten everyone else into not developing nuclear weapons. It could have become an armed hegemon. Nuclear weapons could have been the Death Star. They could have held the world in their grips through the power of fear, but they didn't. Countries tend to choose restraint historically with nuclear weapons, even when they have at least on paper, the option of using them. And one of the reasons for this is the nuclear taboo. Nuclear weapons are different. It's obviously horrible when you use conventional weapons to inflict a loss of life or suffering on anybody. But the world seems to have decided at a legal, at a political, at a psychological level that nuclear weapons are different. and there's a very intense stigma against their use, which is nearly universal. And importantly, powers have a real interest in maintaining that taboo. The world is better for most countries, the overwhelming majority of countries, because there is a taboo against nuclear weapons use. It comes with a whole bunch of benefits. The first is we don't all die. Nuclear exchanges would threaten the very essence of the global economy, our prosperity, and our very lives. So it's great for all of us that nuclear weapons aren't just being flung around like conventional weapons. The economy does better because not everyone is dead, and you're also not in a race to proliferation. If nuclear weapon use was acceptable, then the only way to feel secure, realistically, would be to have a nuclear weapon, which would probably take you back to point 1 or 2, because if everyone starts proliferating and has nuclear weapons and the whole world is drowning in them, then inevitably, eventually, someone's going to use one, and you run into the don't die problem all over again. And I'm really focused, and I think a lot of strategists are really focused on the not dying part. That's a real benefit of the nuclear taboo, the fact that we haven't all died. So because so many nations, whether that be China, America, or indeed nations around the world, have an interest in maintaining this taboo, you can expect that any nation breaching this taboo can expect very serious consequences, because most nations would want to ensure that that experience isn't repeated. They'd want to retaliate in some way against countries that do use nuclear weapons in order to maintain this norm of non-use. Now, there have been, and I need to be clear here, some historical figures that haven't minded. If you want to go look up what Mao Zedong thought about nuclear war and the fact that realistically losing a few hundred million people was acceptable as a price to pay for victory, by all means go for it. But for the most part, the leaders of most nations on this planet have a deep interest in maintaining this nuclear taboo. So let's do a worked example of why this nuclear coercive sort of idea doesn't tend to really work. Let's just say we have a hypothetical small country that's subject to potential atomic coercion by a large neighbor, trying to force it not to do something really fundamental. Let's just take a random example, like, say, joining an alliance. The little nation wants to join an alliance, and the big nation next door with nuclear weapons says, hey, don't, or we might potentially deploy nuclear weapons against you. Well, the little nation has to ask itself a question. Is the Red Force bluffing or not? If they are bluffing, or you're confident they're bluffing, then the nuclear coercion isn't going to work. The little nation's going to go ahead and do what it was going to do anyway, which is it joins the big alliance. Let's call them Blue Force. If Red Force isn't bluffing, well then small country's in a serious problem. Because if you have a large neighbor who is crazy enough to nuke you if you try and exercise your sovereignty, well then the fundamental existence of your state is at risk. And the only alternative to slavery, where you basically do whatever it is the large state asks you to do, the only solution becomes coming under someone else's nuclear umbrella, so you can't be coerced with nuclear weapons anymore. In which case, the correct decision is to join Blue Force, because then you're under Blue Force's nuclear umbrella and no one can threaten you with nukes anymore. A country, and everyone knows this, a country is unlikely to be willing to follow through on most coercive threats, so the credibility of using nuclear weapons when you're threatening someone is actually really, really low. And if you are crazy enough to possibly follow through, then everyone around you is going to focus on obtaining a deterrent as the overriding priority. This is the basic game theory failing of nuclear coercion. Most of the time, people don't believe you, so it doesn't work. And if people do believe you, they will do anything necessary in order to get into a situation where you can't threaten them with annihilation anymore. And usually that means doing exactly the thing that you don't want them to do in the first place, which is signing up with your nuclear-armed enemies. Russia might be tempted to employ nuclear saber-rattling at the moment precisely because most of their conventional military is occupied in Ukraine. They have precious few arrows left in their quiver if they're looking to exert pressure on surrounding nations right now. The nuclear weapons are one of the few things they have. But just because they have them doesn't mean they're an effective tool of international coercion. So, let's talk about Russian doctrine. What does Russia actually say when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons, and why should we care? And the first thing to say here is that countries tend to put a lot of effort into publicly declaring and outlining what their nuclear strategy, what their doctrine is, answering the questions of when might they use nuclear weapons, how would they use nuclear weapons, why do they maintain nuclear weapons, how likely are they to use them in certain circumstances. Nations put a lot of effort into publicly declaring, or often publicly declaring, these things. The public nature of nuclear doctrine is what wraps it up in what's called declaratory strategy, where you use public statements of your intentions as a part of your overarching strategy. So Russia has written nuclear doctrine and nuclear statements. The United States has equivalents, and all nuclear-armed nations in the Western world have publicly stated equivalents. There are also declaratory strategies from countries like India and China that, for example, limit their willingness to deploy nuclear weapons first. And you might ask the question why you should care. After all, if you believe politicians or a segment of politicians are liars, why would you choose to believe the doctrine that they put out? Well, the first answer to that is that nuclear weapons are special, like I've said. Their primary utility comes from the threat of their existence rather than from their actual use. So you need a way to threaten people with nuclear weapons, but you can't actually go around using them or we end up accidentally destroying the planet, which is, for most people, not very high on the national priority list. So the aim is generally strategic stability, and that requires you to state your intentions very, very clearly rather than risk confusion where people accidentally overstep each other's lines, someone gets nuked, and then again, we end up destroying the planet. You'll see that a lot of elements of nuclear strategy come down to the goal of not ending up in a situation where the planet's destroyed. Relatively simple. Doctrine and the surrounding declaratory policy around that is how you accomplish this signaling. You tell everyone where you're really serious, where you'll use nuclear weapons, where you won't, and that gives everyone an idea of what the rules of the game are so that no one really gets nuked by surprise. China, India, these are examples of countries that, for example, have non-first use pledges. So they say that they will not deploy nuclear weapons unless someone else deploys weapons of mass destruction against them first. And that allows them to interact in the playground with other nations around the world without people worrying that they're suddenly going to get hit by a first strike, or at least they're less likely to get hit by a first strike. Because it's fair to say that no one fully believes anyone else, but these doctrinal documents, they help. They serve an important purpose. Lavrov came out and said this line: "We don't have insane people, we have a nuclear doctrine," when he was asked the question about nuclear saber rattling. He pointed to the atomic doctrine as a signal mechanism of when Russia would consider using nuclear weapons. And of course, one of the great influences behind that atomic doctrine is Vladimir Putin. And there's been a couple of YouTube videos and articles that have come out that really seem to suggest that Vladimir Putin loves atomic weapons and is indeed a nuclear warmonger. And it's quite easy for people to pull out quotes from him or doctrines that he has passed which actually lower the nuclear threshold. It's easy to quote Putin badly, and one of the reasons is he's been in power a really long time. Because if you look at Soviet and Russian nuclear doctrine, and this is a gross oversimplification, but the basic evolution after the fall of the Soviet Union is this. 1993, Yeltsin's nuclear doctrine, very much focused on just straight atomic deterrence as we would think about it in the West, or at least that's the simple way to describe it here. He pares back some of the more apocalyptic ideas around battlefield nuclear weapon employment that we saw in the Soviet Union. 2000, Putin comes in, and Putin arguably lowers the nuclear threshold in 2000. The reason for this is the conventional weakness of the Russian armed forces at the time. This is the Russian armed forces at their low ebb after the fall of the Soviet Union. They're pretty trashed here. They've seen NATO forces absolutely demolish Iraq in the Gulf War. They've had their own serious failings in Chechnya and places like that. The conventional forces aren't up to the job, and one of the few things that Russia can rely on at this point is its atomic weapons, so they have a greater place in the doctrine. But then in 2010, Dmitry Medvedev rolls back the nuclear use cases. He increases the nuclear threshold. He reduces the number of cases where Russia will use nuclear weapons in localized conflicts. And then in 2014, Putin comes back, and at this point, if Putin was a nuclear warmonger, you'd expect him to undo all of Medvedev's changes, go back to something more like 2000. Instead, he doubles down on non-nuclear deterrence concepts, the idea that you shouldn't rely on nuclear weapons for all of your deterrence requirements. He doesn't reintroduce really low threshold atomic use. Indeed, we start thinking that maybe conventional precision weapons might be able to take over some of the role that tactical nuclear weapons, for example, previously had. It's a simplification, but that's basically what 2014 boils down to. And then in 2020, which is the document we're going to focus on, we have the basic principles of state policy of the Russian Federation on nuclear deterrence, if I've gotten that right from memory, which basically sets out the use cases for atomic weapons as we believe they stand now. Now, Russian thinkers have been doubting the value of nuclear deterrence against non-existential threats for a long time. The fight has gone back and forth. between those who thought the conventional capabilities needed to be rebuilt, because that was the only way you'd have deterrence, and those who thought you could get away with just basically having a massive atomic weapons program, and that'd do it. The current thinking seems to weigh towards conventional weapons, and there's a reason for that. So arguably, I would say this. Putin is both responsible for lowering the nuclear threshold, which is increasing the risk of nuclear weapons use by the Russian Federation, but he's also a person responsible for reducing that same risk. It's just whether you're talking about Putin in the early 2000s or Putin circa 2020. And Putin circa 2020, who has more confidence in his modernized armed forces, is more willing to rely on concepts like non-nuclear deterrence. And a brief historical aside here to just say that even the early 2000s Putin doctrines were, by historical standards of nuclear doctrine, really, really restrained. If you ever want genuinely good nightmare fuel that will keep you up awake or convince you that humanity must be ungodly lucky in order to have survived the Cold War era, go look up Cold War era nuclear doctrines. In the early 1950s, indeed through much of the 1950s, when the United States was still ascendant in terms of nuclear capabilities, but there was a great fear of Soviet conventional superiority, the doctrine was massive retaliations. The idea was that even a relatively limited conventional Soviet military incursion in Eastern Europe, or rather Central Europe, would result in massive atomic retaliation. There was basically one setting. It was a Soviet soldier puts a boot over the border and you nuke Moscow. It was basically the setting that the United States had through the early part of the Cold War. In 1962, the United States does an exercise in order to bring together one single integrated operational plan, PSYOP 1962, which is to basically tie together a strike plan for the US atomic arsenal. There's one plan. It's not particularly gradated. That doesn't come until 1963. But according to the 1962 plan, in the event that war breaks out, there's one strike package. It calls for 3,200 nuclear warheads. There's about 8,000 megatons TNT equivalent. 24 warheads go to Moscow. The USSR, the People's Republic of China, and Eastern Europe are all basically glassed. Albania is basically gone. There's virtually no flexibility. Look, even if the question was even asked, what if China is not in the war? And the planners responded essentially saying, well, that would make the plan difficult then because it's designed to be executed basically as is. And it was implied that maybe they'd go anyway. Obviously, they wouldn't have, but the point was the planning thought about communism as one giant monolithic block, and the response to any military offensive in Europe was basically going to be the death of nearly 300 million people, with the relatively rapid dispatch of nearly 3,200 nuclear warheads. And the Soviet war plans for Europe were also pretty nightmare fuel-esque. The Soviets always presumed that nuclear weapons had to be written into war plans for Europe. I think there were a lot of Soviet thinkers who thought that NATO strategic planners who thought nuclear escalation could be controlled were probably naive. And as a result, basically all of the Soviet war planning assumes that Europe is basically not there by the end of it. Genuinely nightmare fuel when we compare it to all post-Soviet Russian nuclear doctrine, and in particular, the document that came out in 2020. So this 2020 statement, the basic principles of state policy of the Russian Federation on nuclear deterrence. This is a very short document. You can find the English language version online, and if you want to check it against the original Russian, you can find that too. And people have found a lot of reasons, usually when they're looking for reasons, but people have found a lot of reasons to be very scared of the statement. They'd like to take quotes out of context. In particular, this one's a fan favorite. In the event of a military conflict, this policy provides for the prevention of an escalation of military actions and their termination on conditions that are acceptable for the Russian Federation and its allies. People like to interpret this statement to mean that if Russia is in a conflict and it's not going so well, they might use nuclear weapons in order to win. In order to ensure that the conflict ends, it ends then, and it ends on conditions that Russia finds favorable. My warning in reading statements like that is that you should probably read them in context. And the very next paragraph is, the Russian Federation considers nuclear weapons exclusively as a means of deterrence, their use being an extreme and compelled measure. So the very next statement sort of puts a caveat on the previous one. These are not weapons that Russia is looking to employ just because things aren't going their way. They're things that they're using as an extreme and compelled measure of deterrence against an opponent. But you know what? You don't need to take my word for it in terms of interpreting those first paragraph, because the document also sets out 4 very clear reasons where Russia would consider using nuclear weapons. You can read the document, they're there in subparagraph form. The 4 reasons are pretty simple. The first is someone's launching a ballistic missile attack against the territory of the Russian Federation. So if they detect American missiles are flying, they're going to launch theirs rather than waiting for those missiles to hit first. American nuclear doctrine is counter-force, is what is the term for it, which is America intends to use its nuclear weapons to target the nuclear weapons and command and control and military assets of their opponents. So Russia's doctrine is not to wait for those missiles to arrive and destroy all of its missiles. It's to get its missiles in the air before they arrive in order to make sure that America hurts a lot for its temerity in launching its missiles. And as a result, America's never going to launch its missiles in the first place. The second reason is if nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction are actually used against the Russian Federation or its allies. So if Ukraine, I don't know, rolls out anthrax weapons or something, maybe Russia would consider deploying nuclear weapons, or indeed if Ukraine gets its own nuclear weapons, Russia would feel free to then employ its own nukes. The third is in the case of an attack by an adversary against critical government or military sites of the Russian Federation, which is where most people stop this quote. An awful lot of media reports I saw stop the quote at this point and say, ooh, if we bomb critical infrastructure in Russia, they might use nukes. But no, there's a comma there, and the next part of the sentence is, disruption of which would undermine nuclear forces' response actions. So what the Russians are saying here is that if you're destroying sites which might inhibit their ability to launch a nuclear counterstrike, they're not going to wait and see if your plan is to take their nuclear weapons offline. They're going to launch first. If they can't be sure whether or not a nuclear attack is coming later, but if you're going to take away their ability to use their nukes, they're going to launch their nukes. They don't want to be caught without them as a deterrent force. And finally, reason 4, aggression against the Russian Federation with conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. So this is the existential argument. If Polish volunteers are driving their tanks through the streets of Moscow with winged husaria wings strapped to the turrets, and they're about to storm the Kremlin, then Russia is probably going to deploy its atomic weapons at that point. Indeed, they'll probably deploy them before that point, because at that stage, the threat is to the very existence of the Russian Federation. Now, there's an argument over whether there's an extra idea embedded in this doctrine. It's an idea that I would argue isn't actually there, but if you read the United States Nuclear Posture Review, the idea is pretty clearly present. And it's called escalate to de-escalate. So basically, the idea here is that Russia might launch a tactical nuclear weapon to basically force everyone to chill. That everyone will be so worried about a nuclear weapon finally going off that they'll decide to end the conflict. So Russia might signal that it's willing to stop a conflict by deploying a nuclear weapon as a way to force everyone to sit down and take notice. In the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, which is the United States government's outline of its nuclear thinking and strategy as of 2018, it includes that line there, that Moscow threatens and exercises limited nuclear first use, suggesting a mistaken expectation that coercive nuclear threats or limited first use could paralyze the United States and NATO, and thereby end a conflict on terms favorable to Russia. Some refer to this as escalate to de-escalate. The Russians themselves reject this. I think it's important to highlight that fact. Lavrov has even come out and challenged the thing directly. He said we would not have any escalation in order to de-escalate as Western powers try and present it. Now, I'm going to proceed on the assumption that this is not actually part of Russian nuclear doctrine, but we'll look at potential use cases that are in line with it. So we'll ask ourselves the hypothetical of, if this is true, where might Russia use a nuclear weapon in this scenario, noting that I don't actually believe it's their doctrine. So all of that waffling around doctrine and use cases leads me to ask this question. Will they use nukes? No. With an asterisk, and we'll talk about that asterisk in a moment. And there's a number of reasons I don't think that Russians are going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, or certainly that we are nowhere near the stage where they would. The first is, as we've talked about already, there is no doctrinal use case. The conflict in Ukraine doesn't trigger any of the 4 conditions in the 2020 Basic Principle. Russia isn't going to get hit by nuclear weapons. The Americans aren't launching missiles at them. There's no risk of them losing their government command and control over their atomic arsenals. And there's certainly no existential threat to the survival of the Russian state. Even NATO entry into the war, conventional entry in the territory of Ukraine, hypothetically, theoretically, wouldn't trigger any of these conditions. Now, NATO is unlikely to test those conditions, by going into Ukraine conventionally. But it's important to note that Russian doctrine as it stands doesn't call for an atomic response anything short of an existential threat to the survival of the Russian state. Now, some might choose to interpret any reversal as a potential existential threat to the Russian state. But there's one saving grace here, and that's actually the Russian control of their domestic media. Russian media in this case is arguably a potential force for peace and restraint in this conflict. I talked in my Who's Winning video about how wide the Russian war goals are in terms of their ability to be redefined. Because your goal is the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and because that can mean basically anything, you combine that with a really powerful domestic propaganda machine, and it's really easy for Russia to convince its people that it won, basically no matter what happens. Which means that even in circumstances where Russia arguably loses a conventional conflict in Ukraine, it's unlikely to threaten the integrity of the regime or the continuation of the Russian state. All because the media is capable of packaging up whatever happens in such a way that even the regime of Vladimir Putin is likely not going to be under serious domestic threat, at least at this stage of the day. Russia doesn't need to deploy desperate measures like nukes to achieve a particular military outcome, because it can just shape perceptions of what's been achieved instead. And there's a lot less threat there than there would be for actual military escalation. The second point is that there's no, as far as I can see, no military utility. A number of commentators have pointed out it's hard to actually find a mission for tactical nuclear weapons on the Ukrainian battlefield. Just a few weapons used at the local level are very unlikely to be decisive. Nuclear weapons are powerful, but they're not so powerful that they just delete the Ukrainian army if you fire off one or two of them. This isn't civilization where you drop one on a province and all the opponent's military units there disappear. The Russians are faced with irregulars, maneuver elements, light infantry, hundreds upon hundreds of kilometers of trench line, and using just one or two nuclear weapons isn't really going to break open or destroy the ability of the Ukrainian army to resist. So it's hard to see how you deliver a decisive blow short of a massive employment of nuclear weapons, certainly not a limited one. And at the same time, there's massive countervailing risks of a NATO response. And this comes back to this idea of the nuclear taboo. If Russia breaches the nuclear taboo, the only way to get that taboo back in place is to put in place a precedent that the country that uses nuclear weapons will be subject to so much retaliation, be that economic or kinetic, that it would have been better off never using the nuclear weapons in the first place. That's the only message that's going to restrain other nations from using nukes in the future. So what would likely happen? Well, those neutral, in inverted commas, countries that Russia is really relying on, the Indians, the Chinese, they're very likely to instantly shun Russia, because as much as they have economic and political interests in Russia, they have deeper interests in the maintenance of the nuclear taboo. There's also likely to be a very major NATO response. Now, NATO has already said that there would be a serious response to Russian chemical use. Nuclear weapons are, while part of that NBC triad of weapons of mass destruction, generally regarded as much more taboo and devastating than chemical weapons. So NATO would have a number of options before it. It could jump straight to a nuclear response, but its conventional superiority is such that it could also inflict a major but limited conventional kinetic response or an economic and political response that achieved more in harming Russia than Russia achieves by using its tactical nuclear weapons. Russia might gain some military momentum by blasting open one or two defensive positions with tactical nuclear weapons, but if the response is an immediate total energy embargo globally against Russian energy, or if the response is a limited kinetic strike by NATO air power to eliminate Russian forces in Ukraine, or even a limited NATO entry into the territory of Ukraine in retaliation, then that's going to negate any advantage that Russia gets from deploying that weapon in the first place. So it's entirely possible for NATO to make this entire exercise of using a nuclear weapon counterproductive for Russia without triggering any of the Russian nuclear use cases. You don't have to nuke Russia, and you don't have to existentially threaten the Russian state in order to make it not worth them using nuclear weapons in the first instance. But let's just say you really, really want to build that doomsday bunker. You're a really big Fallout fan. You love that 1950s retro vibe. You're looking for some hope here, and a question is, when might nuclear weapons actually be used? And I'll stress here that I can't just dismiss the danger that an escalation chain might run out of hand. there have always been dangers, ever since the nuclear weapon was invented, that we would have either accidental or deliberate circumstances put in place that would lead us down an escalation chain to the point where more nuclear weapons are used. We can think about where some of those triggers might be, especially if you have the escalate to de-escalate definition in mind. The two that I think of immediately, if territorial integrity or the loss of Russian territory is considered to be an existential threat to the state. Russian doctrine doesn't say that, but let's just say they decide that it is. Crimea is probably the first place that could possibly be tested. If Ukraine ever tried to militarily reclaim the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia has formally annexed, which differentiates it from Donetsk and Lugansk, which are their own people's republics, if Crimea itself was threatened, you might see Russian nuclear posturing. The other element is if somehow Russian command and control itself was being threatened. And I don't mean generals dying in Ukraine. I mean Vladimir Putin's ability to control the strategic Russian rocket forces and the Russian atomic arsenal. If that was somehow being threatened, maybe. If those circumstances are triggered, what you would probably see is that if things were going really, really badly, Russia might signal that it's getting ready to use nuclear weapons. Not that it would jump straight to their use, but that it would signal that it's getting ready to deploy them. That would probably be its first step, and then employment would actually be a second step. But again, I don't read this into Russian doctrine. I don't read a sign that their back's against the wall, in a very narrow sense, leads to them using nuclear weapons. I don't think that nuclear weapons would be the first port of call. This is a country that hasn't even declared war and undergone general mobilization yet. And you'd like to imagine that there are several steps left on their escalation chain to respond before they resort to the deployment of nuclear weapons. At the same time, the Ukrainians have been pretty clear that they don't plan to, or at least they have in the past been clear that they don't plan to reclaim Crimea by force, even though they continue to claim it. So the risk to the territorial integrity of Russia itself is relatively limited. I will say, overall, that the risk is very low and that you can probably sleep well at night. But if you want to sleep extra well, the question is, how are you extra sure? How do you make extra sure that Russia doesn't deploy its nuclear weapons? And the answer is the old Cold War strategy of signaling and deterrence. There's nothing new to this idea, but the idea is that you're very clear that any nuclear use would leave Russia in an unambiguously worse position than it would be but for the strike. This is good old-fashioned game theory. You convince your opponent that if he does something you don't like, he's going to end up in a worse position if he does it. This could, as I said before, take the form of a conventional kinetic response or economic sanctions or political sanctions or a variety of means that you could use to inflict more damage on Russia than they gain benefit from using their nuclear weapons. We can also talk about the off-ramp argument here. A lot of Western pundits have been very clear on the need to preserve an off-ramp for Putin, so he never feels like he's got his back against the wall and he has no choice but to escalate. I think this argument is overblown. I don't think Russia has shown so far any sign that it's really looking for an off-ramp. It's more likely looking for escalation rather than de-escalation. But at the end of the day, all maintaining an off-ramp really means in this context is leaving open a situation for Russia to negotiate an end to the war. Not that it has to be one that's favourable to Russia, just that it's one that doesn't trigger those 4 nuclear use principles. Most importantly, that it doesn't pose an existential threat to the Russian state, and that it doesn't involve Russia getting nuked. If you can do that and you avoid hitting any of those 4 nuclear triggers in the 2020 statement, then you're probably fine. You can also secure preemptive diplomatic pressure from neutral parties. So what I mean here, you want to have the Indias and the Chinas and the other major players in this quietly remind Russia that, hey guys, we've taken the stance we have, but if you deploy nuclear weapons, then that's going to change. We're going to be in a very different world if you do that, so it'd be really good if you didn't do that. The final point I'll say is that you should never sow doubt about your response. NATO should be very clear that there will be a response, that it will maintain the nuclear taboo in the event that Russia deploys a nuclear weapons, and it should never give its opponents any reason to doubt that. If Russia has certainty that using nuclear weapons will leave it in a worse position, then it's unlikely to use them. That's the reality of deterrence. All right, so some key takeaways to close this out. And the first one's pretty obvious. Nuclear weapons are really scary, but we need to keep a clear head regarding the potential and likelihood for their use. Russia has dual-use capable weapons everywhere. And almost every time Russia moves a weapon system, be it a cruise missile or an Iskander tactical ballistic missile, they're moving nuclear-capable systems because most of their missiles in those categories can take nuclear warheads or non-nuclear warheads. But the reality is there's a long jump from the deploying of those weapon systems to actually using nuclear weapons. In fact, I'd go further and say that Russian published nuclear doctrine does not call for tactical nuclear weapon use in Ukraine, which makes it very unlikely. You'd want to signal your intention to use nuclear weapons, either through doctrine or through some other statement. We haven't seen an indication from Russia that they're willing to do so. I'd also go further and say that nuclear coercion has a pretty spotty record. It rarely works. So the idea of using nuclear threats either to constrain Ukraine or to constrain, say, for example, other countries that might consider joining the NATO alliance, for example, that sort of coercion has a really spotty record and there's no reason to believe that it's likely to succeed. Indeed, the audience for those sort of threats is mostly the less educated members of the foreign public and also the domestic audience. This is all balanced against the fact that the nuclear taboo is really real. Nations have a real interest in enforcing and maintaining this prohibition, this idea that you don't just use nuclear weapons to solve basic military problems, that you keep them in this sort of special category and don't deploy them. That means that Russia is likely to face retaliation from neutral powers and from NATO powers in the event that it ever deploys nuclear weapons in the Ukrainian conflict. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep in mind those cases where nuclear use might become more likely. And nothing that I've said in this video should be taken as a definitive statement that Russia absolutely will not deploy nuclear weapons in the current crisis. What I'm saying, however, is that it seems very, very unlikely. And unless this war fundamentally changes to the point where it does pose an identifiable existential threat to the existence of the Russian state, that the use cases are likely to remain very, very unlikely. Preventing that escalation entirely or keeping that probability low, well, that's a matter for signaling and deterrence on the part of the NATO and also on the part of neutral powers. It means powers reassuring Russia that there will be consequences for nuclear weapon employment, and as a result, discouraging and deterring Russia from ever seeking to use those weapon systems. But again, nuclear use remains highly unlikely within the framework of Russian doctrine and strategic logic. It's hard to see a scenario, no matter how this conflict goes, at least from where we can see from here, where Russia reaches for that nuclear trigger. And I hope that in a little bit of reverse clickbait, actually helps everyone sleep just a little bit better tonight. All right, channel update to go with this. First off, this is my first video coming back from COVID. COVID is terrible. I do not recommend getting it to anyone. I'm still incredibly tired, and if you're wondering why the editing on this video is a little bit choppy, it's probably because I have to edit out all the coughing. That said, I'm back, and it feels good to be back. One of the things I'm doing is I'm trying to clear my email backlog from both of the email addresses. I just practically can't respond to all of the email, but what I am doing is harvesting and categorizing all of it so that I can act on it where I need to. I'll also give a quick update on subtitles. I've received a lot of great offers on people who are willing to help refine the subtitling I use on my videos. I'm probably going to make contact with one or two of them before the next video and trial some of their mechanisms. There are some people, some pretty cool AI and scribing services out there who've offered to help out. The next thing I'm going to say is that Purin Gaming is now a thing. Purin Gaming AU. The YouTube address for the channel is there on the screen, and I'll also link it in the description to this video. There's nothing on there yet, but that is going to be where I release my new gaming content videos, and I'm also going to migrate some of my existing gaming content to that channel. Like I said, this is intended to stream the gaming content away from the primary channel so that you can subscribe to one or both without worrying about getting notifications for content that you may not actually be interested in. Also, YouTube is literally, it's sending me one of those trophy things that you get for like 100,000 subscribers, which is pretty incredible. And I can't wait to get it, but there it is. It's ordered, it's happening. I've crossed 100,000, which is incredible for a guy who does slideshows on the internet. So that's very, very exciting. I'm also doing a staged overhaul of my Patreon, so I'm steadily changing the way the tiers work just so it's better designed for both gaming and non-gaming content. So stick with me on that one as I make those changes, because the summary is I'm getting back into it very, very slowly. The worst part of COVID is fatigue. It knocks you out constantly. and I'm still getting my energy back. So I appreciate you being with me today. I appreciate you guys listening to this video. It was one I did primarily because so many people who sent me emails were very, very concerned. And I thought about it for a while, and I was like, while I could do a video on Russian nuclear capabilities, a far more useful contribution would be to outline why Russian nuclear use remains very, very unlikely. We can talk about Russian nuclear capabilities if there's something people are interested in. The development of their intermediate range weapons, the new generation of ICBMs and SLBMs, these are all very, very interesting things. But at the end of the day, it doesn't take away from the fact that they're very, very, very unlikely to actually use any of them. And that was what I wanted to achieve with this video today. So thank you again to all of you for all of your support, both in the past and going forward. And I'll see you all again soon.